Welcome back, family heads, to possibly the last installment of Family Vacation. That's right, gang, the summer is coming to an end, and with that, Season 2 is right around the corner. We hope you enjoyed these little mini-episodes while the main show is on hiatus, and let us know if you want to see something similar in the future when the show goes on breaks. But focusing on this week, I'm finally finishing the Season 1 ranking with my top 10 albums that we've covered on the show so far. Just like last week, we've got all bangers all across the board, but even more so this week, since some of these albums are all-time favorites of mine. I've got a lot to say about each of these albums, but first, I'm going to take a little break, and I'll be right back with number 10. Hey Matt, you know what I love?
Steely Dan?
Well, yes, but I also love how easy it is for two goobers like us to make a podcast.
I mean, with Spotify for Podcasters, it's no wonder. Spotify for Podcasters is a one-stop shop that's got everything you need to create the perfect podcast.
That's right. Using Spotify for Podcasters, you can directly record and edit your podcast wherever you are, using their intuitive and easy-to-use website.
And once you're done editing, Spotify for Podcasters takes care of the hard part and distributes your podcast directly to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are available.
And now you can even make video podcasts available on Spotify, which gives you even more freedom to make the podcast you want, while also giving your lovely listeners a chance to see your face.
Speaking of listeners, Spotify for Podcasters also encourages fan engagement by letting you get feedback directly from your listeners with Q&As and polls made by you.
You can even make money with your podcast through ads, podcast subscriptions, and donations directly from your audience.
Spotify for Podcasters offers all of this, and it's completely free to use with no catch whatsoever.
Guys, Spotify for Podcasters made recording and distributing the family album so easy. Being able to schedule our episodes ahead of time and letting them take care of distribution took so much weight off our shoulders.
For anyone that's ever even thought about starting a podcast, we highly recommend giving Spotify for Podcasters a try.
You can download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Once again, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters.
And we're back. Without further ado, coming in at number 10, we've got Devo's eclectic new wave debut, Are We Not Men, We Are Devo. This is an album that I was very excited to bring on the podcast ever since we started planning the show last year. Devo's just got this infectious, chaotic energy that truly embodies the spirit of punk, yet has a style that's all their own. While also writing songs that criticize society, Devo's execution is just so entertaining and makes them truly stand out among their new wave peers. This is also helped by Mark Mothersbaugh's vocal delivery, which is so weird and exaggerated yet so captivating that you just can't stop listening. On top of that, Devo's songs are driven by killer instrumentals that really makes you buy what the band's selling, even if it's completely ridiculous. Album opener Uncontrollable Urge is a killer start to a killer album with such an infectious guitar hook and drums that continuously build. I especially love how during the verses, the drum beat switches between these accented hits and a standard rock beat as a way to transition between each line sung. It's a really engaging technique that gives the track such fun, spastic energy. Other highlights include Gut Feeling Slap Your Mammy, which has these really fun synths and a guitar riff that makes the song feel so commanding. Praying Hands is a goofy satirical look at religion with a silly surf rock instrumental. And their cover of the Rolling Stones' Satisfaction is very different and weird, but a really cool interpretation. It's really slick and has this odd drum beat that makes it sound so unique from the original. I think I prefer the Stones version, but it's very cool in its own right. Pretty much every track on here is a winner, and that's in no small part to how it's produced. As we mentioned on the show, Are We Not Men was produced by Brian Eno, which just makes every track sound exquisite. Every song sounds so clean, and there's a heavier emphasis on the keys, allowing the quirkiness of Devo to truly shine through. I'd say the only downside to this album is the track Mongoloid, which we discussed the controversy of on the Devo episode. But bar the song's concept, it's also extremely fun musically, with this driving bass line and accented guitar hits. Are We Not Men, We Are Devo is a classic album for a reason. Being at the forefront of the new wave genre, while also paving the way for other weirdos to follow in their footsteps, Devo certainly earns a spot in the top 10. My original ranking for this album was an 8.5 out of 10 and an A-, but we're bumping this one up to a solid A. At number 9, we've got the classic rock titan, Led Zeppelin IV, an album that was very helpful when I was first discovering my taste in music. Also an album we covered on an episode that redefined our podcast lore far more than we ever expected. But Led Zeppelin has nothing to do with Nate Ruess, and that's one of the reasons why it's so good. And I guess it's also good because of its hard rock instrumentals, larger-than-life vocals, and wide array of rock styles that the group covers extremely effectively. From the moment this album starts with opener Black Dog, you can tell you're in for a treat. That guitar riff is legendary, backed by an awesome beat from John Bonham that just complements the guitar so well. And the constant shifting of time signatures truly shows the prog influence that Led Zeppelin doesn't get enough credit for. Other highlights include the ode to 50s rock, aptly titled Rock and Roll, with its insane piano work reminiscent of Little Richard. The bouncy Misty Mountain hop that has these excellent groovy keys the other instruments bounce off of wonderfully, the tender acoustic ballad Going to California, and of course the big kahuna Stairway to Heaven, which has been talked about to death. Led Zeppelin 4 is a timeless album for a reason. Each member of the band plays off each other immaculately, creating epic sonic passages that blend so cohesively and really embody the spirit of rock and roll. Also assisting with this is Robert Plant's vocals. This dude gives it his all on every track and just commands your attention with his energy. I'll be honest, I don't really have anything bad to say about this album. I'd say When the Levee Breaks is probably my least favorite track, but it's a cool cover and a great way to close the album. As one of the pillars of classic rock, Led Zeppelin 4 remains a timeless body of work that truly embodies everything great about rock music. My original rating for this album was a 9.5 out of 10 and an A tier, and that still holds up today. On to number 8, we've got one of the best albums of 2023, Scare in the Hose by JPEG Mafia and Danny Brown. One of the most bombastic and uniquely produced rap albums I've ever heard. I'm confident Scaring the Hose will be considered a classic in due time. The attitude this album exudes is so aggressive, but in the most fun way. Everything is loud and overbearing, but that's all part of the charm. Using the most chaotic combinations of samples, Peggy and Danny deliver beats that, while being far from cohesive, create such an interesting and captivating style of production. Like, who would have thought to make a trap beat with a sample from an old Japanese commercial? And who else could have pulled it off so well? Every beat goes unbelievably hard, from the more standard aggressive hip-hop of Lean Beef Patty to the gospel funk on God Loves You. The duo covers such a wide range of style and genres, but blends them in ways unheard of. Speaking of the duo, let's talk about the chemistry between Peggy and Danny, cause it's off the charts. The charisma these two exude is just fantastic, trading off between bars masterfully while also sounding like they're having so much fun recording. And while on the mic, they have amazing lines and vocal delivery. Danny Brown truly shines on God Loves You, delivering some of the funniest and filthiest religious puns I've ever heard. Some song highlights include Step a Pig, that has these really intense synths and just lets Peggy go absolutely wild on his verses. The title track truly lives up to its name, as the instrumental primarily revolves around clapping and an out-of-place saxophone. Kingdom Hearts Key is probably the most mellow track on the album, but goes just as hard as the rest and is built around a truly beautiful sample. And Perfect is just perfect. It sounds like the soundtrack to a western, with its bombastic horns and extremely deep bass drops. Alright, so what's wrong with this album? Honestly, not much. I'd say tracks like Fentanyl Tester and Shut Yo Bitch Ass Up aren't as strong as others on the album, but with titles like that, they're obviously still amazing. And I guess if you're cringe, you might not like Danny Brown's voice, but lucky for me, I don't have that issue. As you know, family heads, I'm cringe in different ways. Overall, Scaring the Hose is one of the most unique albums I've ever heard, and I wish it continuous success for the rest of the year. My original rating was a 9.5 out of 10 and an A+, and my opinion remains unchanged. A+ for Scaring the Hose. Moving on to number 7, we've got one of the most recognizable city pop albums, Timely by Henri. This album and genre are truly what I love about music as a whole. Timely is such a feel-good album that really captures the atmosphere of summer through the most infectiously upbeat instrumentals. The funk and disco elements of city pop make it one of my favorite genres, as the focus on bass lines and horns just make every song feel so good. Couple that with Henri's passionate vocals, the stellar instrumental arrangements, and the incredible pecker on drums, you've got yourself a certified classic. Track highlights include Cat's Eye, which is a fun, energetic opener that has awesome accented hits and an incredibly funky bass line that drives the whole song. Windy Summer is an iconic track in the city pop scene, with excellent trumpet arrangements and a disco drum beat that just makes the song so bouncy. You Are Not Alone is an excellent ballad that really gives Henri's voice a chance to shine. And Shyness Boy is probably my favorite track, as the hook is so catchy with those flowy horns that complement Henri's vocal delivery, as well as the extremely light and airy keys that are peppered throughout. Plus, it's got a phenomenal sax solo, so how could you not love it? And with these incredible instrumental arrangements also comes the immaculate production, which is no surprise as both were done by the legendary Toshiki Katamatsu. Everything sounds so sleek and crisp on this album, ironically giving Timely a timeless sound, letting it stand as the perfect summer album. I really don't have anything bad to say about Timely. It's incredibly consistent all the way through, with perfect pacing that allows tracks to never become tiresome. Maybe some people won't like that they can't understand the lyrics since they're all in Japanese, But I don't have that issue since I'm not a lyrics guy. Plus, Henri's vocal performance does an excellent job of portraying the tone of each song, so even if you can't understand the words, you can still understand the feeling of each song. Timely is a must listen for anyone who wants to get into city pop. Its musical arrangements are designed to make you feel good, and Henri's vocal performance will leave you mesmerized, even if you don't understand Japanese. My original rating was a 9.6 out of 10 and an A+, and would you look at that, I still feel the same way. That'll probably be the case for the rest of these albums going forward. Next up at number 6, we have The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis, which is also the highest ranking guest album on this list. But this is kinda cheating, since this is basically an album I would already bring on the show. Having quite a lot of experience with this album in the past, I was delighted to talk about it on the show, especially since I got to dissect its bizarre plot. As a rock opera, Lamb goes all over the place, both narratively and musically, both of which I find incredibly enjoyable. Genesis is still on their golden age prog shit during this time, so you know the music is gonna be killer. Steve Hackett's guitar work bolsters the atmosphere of each track every moment he's given a chance to shine. Phil Collins remains insane on the drums, playing complex rhythms that drive every track and really makes them move. And Peter Gabriel is obviously the star of the show here, as he is giving it his all since this is his grand finale with Genesis. From a narrative point of view, Peter Gabriel also goes all out, delivering a crazy wacky story about a New York kid who gets sucked into a nightmare world, and through his torturous journey he learns to shed his toxic traits. The concepts that Peter Gabriel came up with for this album are extremely creative and weird, creating a pretty realized world that the story of the album takes place in. Creatures like the Slipper Men, the Carpet Crawlers, and the Lamia are just so interesting from a conceptual standpoint, and it's so fun hearing Gabriel perform as these characters. The album's kind of like a D&D session in a way, with Gabriel serving as the DM, throwing the protagonist into whatever crazy situation he could think of. Track highlights include so many, but starting with the title track, it opens the album perfectly with that groovy bass line and Gabriel's wailing vocals. Cuckoo Cocoon is an underrated piece led by flute and keys that really gives the listener a moment to breathe. Counting Out Time has a hilarious concept and absurd musicality that backs that concept up perfectly. The Carpet Crawlers is one of Genesis' best songs of all time, and the atmosphere of the Lamia is unmatched. Other great songs include The Colony of Slipper Men, Anyway, Lily White Lilith, and It. So what's wrong with this album? Honestly, a couple things. First off, it's incredibly dense. Clocking in at an hour and 30 minutes, this album can be pretty intimidating to get through on a first listen, especially since the story is so nonsensical and not really told in the most easy to follow way. Even though I like it, after my first listen, I had no idea what the story was about, and that was with someone explaining it to me as I was listening. It's needlessly complicated and has a hard time figuring out exactly what it's trying to say, but it's got so much ambition and excitement that you just get lost in this kooky world created by Peter Gabriel. That being said, this album is definitely a grower and best enjoyed in smaller doses. But otherwise, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is fantastic. With its incredibly tight technical musicianship, Gabriel's enthralling personality, and an incredibly quirky and convoluted story, it earns its status as a rock opera staple. My original rating for this album was a 9 out of 10 and an A tier, and I still think that holds up. We've officially entered the top 5 family heads, with Drunk by Thundercat absolutely being a worthy entry. Drunk is an album that I listened to a lot during a very important and impactful time in my life, so it holds a very special place in my heart. But from a non-biased standpoint, this album also just fucks on its own. Thundercat, on top of being one of the best basses alive right now, has such an endearing personality that makes every track such a joy to listen to. He oozes cool, but also likes nerdy things, making him extremely relatable and just fun to hear. And this can easily be heard in the song concepts on this album, as a lot of them are pretty goofy, but are backed by badass instrumentals and very human lyrics. For example, Captain Stupido is about the monotony of life, but centers around the lyrical hook of beat your meat, go to sleep. On top of that, it also has a really energetic beat, with heavenly sounding guitars, as well as really spastic production. It's a very unique song, and that's only the second track. Is an incredibly impressive, almost instrumental track that really sees the bass going crazy as the song centers around this incredibly fast groove. Show You the Way is a love letter to yacht rock that has a fittingly smooth beat and also features legends of the genre Kenny Loggins and Michael McDonald. Tokyo is a very fun song about Thundercat's love of Japan, built around a really light sounding 16th note drum beat and some awesome sounding synths. And Them Changes is Thundercat's biggest song for a reason. That bass line alone cements him as a modern day legend. Also cementing him as a legend are his vocals, which I feel like don't get enough credit. Thundercat tends to stick to higher pitches when he sings, oftentimes using his falsetto, which fits his style surprisingly well. but he also has range, as when he utilizes his lower pitch, it's often to great emotional effect. Drink That specifically stands out as a great example of this, with Thundercat's vocals perfectly fitting the hazy late night vibe this track exudes. I'd say the only problem with this album is that the tracks that follow Drink That just aren't as strong as everything else. But it fits the vibe of the end of the album pretty well as we go deeper into the rabbit hole. Plus 3am is a really show-relatable track, and DUI serves as a nice bookend of the album. Drunk is a modern-day classic. With its extremely impressive and diverse musicality, Thundercat's infectious and endearing personality, and just the overall vibe it exudes, it certainly earns a spot among the top 5. My current rating remains the same as my original, leaving Drunk at an A+. Moving on to number 4, we've got a fan favorite, The Face of Vaporwave, Floral Shop by Macintosh Plus. This album was an absolute joy to talk about on the show, and it remains a frequent listen I use to soundtrack editing these episodes. Floral Shop is an album drenched in atmosphere and aesthetic, causing you to get lost in every sample-based soundscape Vectroid masterfully creates. Through her creative use of obscure samples, this album becomes the epitome of a vibe, and that vibe is literally genre-defining. Utilizing hazy production that plays with pitch, speed, and distortion, it makes every track sound like a dream or a distant memory. You've got samples of yacht rock classics like Pages, video games from the 90s like Turok, and obscure jazz like Dancing Fantasy. But the way she shapes and distorts these samples into something completely different makes this album so impressive and engaging. The title track uses Pages If I Saw You Again in a way that's almost unrecognizable to the original track. The tempo is incredibly sluggish, and the keys stutter in patterns that sound more like a glitching computer than a song. It's such an abstract interpretation of the song it's derived from, but it sounds so cool. And while we're on the topic of tracks, let's talk about more highlights. Library is an iconic track in Vaporwave lore, with its legendary chorus that uses a slowed and pitched down version of Page's You Need a Hero. Chill Diving with Echo is an ethereal track that serves as a checkpoint and really lets the listener reflect on their journey so far. Mathematics utilizes more ambient and industrial elements, creating a truly suffocating experience that's so rewarding to listen to fully develop. And of course, Lisa Frank 420 is the Vaporwave song. Its utilization of Diana Ross's It's Your Move is brilliant, as it creates this incredibly chill yet melancholic atmosphere, like you're reflecting on a past mistake. This album is phenomenal all across the board. With its inventive use of samples that inspired so many who entered the genre later, to just the iconic aesthetic and infectious atmosphere each track exudes, Floral Shop deserves all the hype it gets. My current rating is the same as my original. Floral Shop still remains an S-tier album. Alright, coming in at number 3, we have the second album we ever covered on the show, the immaculately produced jazz rock classic Steely Dan's Asia. This album is the audiophile's dream. Everything about its production is so smooth, crisp, and tight. The instrumentals are wonderfully arranged, with each part complementing the next and blending perfectly to create the ultimate smooth sound. Whether it be the exquisite horn arrangements on Peg, or Walter Becker's killer guitar solo on Home at Last, the sheer musical talent this album contains is surely mind-blowing. And backed by these incredible instrumentals are song concepts and lyrics equipped with Steely Dan's signature cynical flair. Song concepts range from suicidal failed musicians playing One Last Show, jaded boyfriends jealous of their ex's success, and references to the Odyssey. And unsurprisingly, they all work extremely well, both lyrically and tonally. Specific highlights go to the title track, which is a brilliantly arranged piece that utilizes prog elements and has an insane drum solo by the legendary Steve Gadd. Peg is an insanely catchy tune that never gets old, with its amazing hook centered around accented horns and a funky bass line. Deacon Blues is a dour track with an incredible sax section that exudes atmosphere, and every other track on this project is fantastic. There's really no fluff at all. And this can definitely be chalked up to Steely Dan's perfectionist attitude when it came to recording. Spending hours on end to get the perfect take was definitely worth it for the listener, but not at the expense of the musician's well-being. Overall, Asia is amazing. It's technically brilliant and has such a clean sound that never gets old on a re-listen. If only we knew what a battle apple was, this album might have been number 1. Again, my current rating is the same as my original, S tier for Asia. Almost there, gang. At second place, we've got one of my all-time favorite albums, the progressive rock staple, Selling England by the Pound by Genesis. I feel a little bad putting 2 Genesis albums in the top 10, but their music is just too good. Plus, what else was going to be in the top 10? Crybaby? Pentatonics? Have You Met Me? Well, if you have, then you know that prog rock is one of, if not my favorite genre of music, and this album is one of the pillars of that genre. With extremely complex song structures and songs that feel more like full-on compositions, there's so much to dissect on Selling England that makes coming back to it such a delight. Like Lamb Lies Down, Genesis is on their yee prog shit, so the musicality is once again golden. But I feel like here, without the constraints of a narrative, the band really gets to show off their musicality to its fullest extent. Time signatures and tempos are constantly changing, utilizing very complex and unorthodox patterns that shows just how impressive musicians like Steve Hackett and Tony Banks truly are. Specific shoutouts go to the key and guitar work all over this album, as these two truly shine no matter what they're playing. And that also goes for the rest of the band, as everyone's at the top of their game, but Hackett and Banks are definitely highlights. Speaking of highlights, let's talk about some tracks. There's not a bad song on this album, but some of my favorites include the opener, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, with that incredibly fast groove the song's built around, as well as the constant tempo shifts. I Know What I Like is a more standard pop rock song, but it's a personal all-time favorite Genesis track. Its use of flutes and auxiliary percussion creates such a whimsical feeling, and the choruses also go incredibly hard, with Peter Gabriel's vocals being backed perfectly by Tony Banks' keys. Plus, I adore the song's concept of a lawnmower who's just content with his place in life, even if he's wasting his potential. Firth the Fifth is a brilliant composition piece that makes excellent use of a mellotron. More Fool Me changes things up as a stripped-back acoustic piece sung by Phil Collins. And The Cinema Show is my favorite track on the album. Atmospherically, it feels like a play, and musically, it's phenomenal, with my favorite part being Phil Collins' 7/8 drum beat during the keyboard solo. There's so much to love on Selling England, and I really don't see any flaws with it. The album is perfectly paced, and each song fully develops as it goes on, creating gorgeous soundscapes backed by incredible instrumentals and vocals. One of the best prog rock albums of all time, and one of my all-time favorites. Once again, my current rating remains the same as my original, 10 out of 10 and S tier. And we've officially reached the end, family heads. At the number one spot, to no one's surprise, is the landmark progressive rock legend In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. As essentially the grandfather of progressive rock, of course it was going to be this high on the list. With more of a jazz flair, as this was when the genre was still in its infant stages, King Crimson still manages to plant the seeds for where prog rock will go in the future, and this was on their first attempt nonetheless. Like with the Genesis albums, the musicality is absolutely incredible, with song structures that feel so grandiose and epic. Everything about Crimson King is wonderful, and I'd even say flawless. I've said quite a lot during this little mini-series, so I'll leave without saying too much about Crimson King. It pretty much speaks for itself. And of course, my current rating remains the same as my original, but specifically, In the Court of the Crimson King goes to the top of S tier. Well guys, that'll just about do it for this episode, as well as this little mini-series. I hope you guys enjoyed revisiting these albums one last time. It was certainly fun getting to talk about them again. But with this chapter of Season 1 coming to an end, another must begin. That's right, Season 2 should be premiering next week with a brand new episode in the standard format. I hope you all enjoyed this little family vacation. Maybe it won't be the last. But as always, I'm your host AJ Tenari, and Matt and I will see you next week. Thanks for listening.